Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Comprehensive Active Shooter Incident Management, presented by Security Management Magazine and sponsored by Everbridge. Everbridge is a global enterprise software company that provides applications which automate the delivery of critical information to help keep people safe and business running. My name is Mike Moran. I am the Learning Content Director with ASIS International, and I will be your moderator today. Today's presentation will be an hour, including time reserved at the close for questions and answers. We encourage you to submit a question at any time in the Q&A panel. If you hold an ASIS International certification, your attendance today is approved for 1 hour of continuing education toward that recertification. This credit will be applied automatically based on your attendance record for this event. This is the second in a 3-part series on active shooter management. You will receive an email tomorrow with a link to today's archive event. That email will also have links to the other events in the series, 7 Best Practices for Active Shooter Preparedness, which is now available. It will also have a link to register for the 3rd event in this series, Shooter Down Active Shooter Consequence Management, which will be presented on June 1. That email will also contain a link to a brief online survey that will ask you to assess today's presentation. Both the Society and our sponsors and presenters are committed to continuous improvement of our growing online events. Please do take a few moments when you get that email to fill out the survey. You are indispensable in shaping the work ahead. There are a number of active shooter assets in the resources panel. I would encourage you to check those out. Those come from Everbridge, ASIS, and Security Management Magazine. I am really pleased and gratified to report that more than 3,400 people have registered for today's event, making this the largest online event we have ever produced. We are not going to get to every question asked today, but I don't want that to dissuade you from asking. So we will follow up with questions that aren't addressed after the event by email. We are very fortunate to have with us today Stephen Crimando. Stephen Crimando is the principal of Behavioral Science Applications, a training and consulting firm focused on human factors in crisis prevention and response. Steve is board certified expert in traumatic stress, a certified trauma specialist, and holds a level 5 certification in Homeland Security. He is a diplomat of both the American Academy for Experts in Traumatic Stress and National Center for Crisis Management. You can read more about Steve's background here or on the bio panel we have on the left. But right now, I know we have a lot of ground to cover. So Steve, I'm going to get out of the way and let you get down to business.
Mike, thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining the program today. I really appreciate you taking the time and effort out of your busy day for this, and I certainly hope to bring some value to that time that you're investing. As you see kind of in my background, and Mike started to allude to, my background is actually as a behavioral scientist, trained as a clinical psychologist, and I work primarily in an area today that's referred to often as operational psychology. By definition, that's the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical or their operational value. So not for the assessment, diagnosis, or treatment of things related, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or other mental health conditions. Really, how do we start to look at human behavior or human factors in a way that informs us in terms of people's behavior during a crisis event. Now, we're going to broaden this today, and one of the things you may have noticed on the cover slide was this phrase about maturing your active shooter response plans. And this program, as you'll see very quickly, it's not an active shooter 101 level course. We're making certain assumptions that you and your organization have a good depth of basic knowledge. There's lots of good guidance out there, whether it's the NYPD active shooter recommendations, it's the FBI guidance, the many different sources. We're making some fundamental assumptions that you've got a pretty good handle on it, and we're looking to step it up. We're looking to take your active shooter preparedness, response, and recovery plans hopefully to another level, and we're going to do that by looking at human factors, looking at the people piece of this and what we do across the whole life cycle of an active shooter event. One of the fundamental concepts, this will be about the most psychological I get in our program today, is what we refer to as Lewin's equation. Dr. Kurt Lewin was thought to be the father of social psychology, and Lewin had said that behavior is a function of both the person and the environment. I don't need to tell you all, as a group or individuals, that being inside an active shooter event, being inside a deadly force encounter of that type, is a very, very rarefied sort of environment. And the sort of behaviors it will bring out of people obviously are radically different than any other sort of crisis. So I want to stop there for one moment. I said that, those are one of the few psychological concepts I'm going to share today, but I just want to piggyback that on for one moment to make a point on how your active shooter and your violence prevention programs need to be distinct, and you can't be making the same assumptions you do in other forms of emergency management. And that's simply to say that when we look at human behavior in crisis conditions, we know it's both phase-specific, meaning it's sensitive to timeline. The way people react in hour one is different than day one, week one, month one, year one, and so forth. And that's going to inform our discussion today. But also it's very hazard-specific. We do not react the same way to fire, flood, and earthquake as we do to a disease outbreak, as we do to a shooting event or some other sort of act of mass violence. So with that in mind, we come back to this idea that we need to have some understanding of both what these events are like, right? So that's the idea of the environment, but also what people are most likely to do or not do in those situations. And that all comes down to what you see in the red on this slide, which is the tremendous importance of making accurate behavioral assumptions to guide plans, policies, and even exercises around active shooter. One of the things you may hear me say once or twice during the program today is when we think about exercising, two critical thoughts just to get out of the way very early in our presentation. One is that during a crisis, we do not rise to the occasion. We fall to our training. So when the discussion comes up in your organization about rehearsals and drills and exercises and different ways of keeping practice alive, it's important that you practice, but it's also important that you practice making realistic assumptions about what everyone in the shooter event is likely to do. That means the shooter, our potential victims and witnesses, our incoming law enforcement, everyone who's in that environment. So this theme of accurate behavioral assumptions, it's going to kind of transcend everything we do, and it's how we help mature your existing active shooter plans, policies, and procedures. How we take them up to the next level is by layering on top of the work you've done these human factors in a way that we really test our assumptions to say, is this really how this is going to go down? So in doing that, what I proposed for our work session together this afternoon is to discuss quickly 5 areas for maturity. Now, one of the things that many people walk away from this sort of session with, I hope, is questions, more questions. And some of those will be like in the Q&A section later, but I really mean questions you bring back to your organization and say, do we have this? Does the things that Steve mentioned in the webinar, do they make sense in our setting? And I understand in a group of 3,400 people who registered for the class, we've obviously got tremendous variation in the type of work settings, the type of workforce, the type of risks you have in your environment. So we're making some generalizations here, and it's going to be up to you to kind of really think, how much does this fit my world and our organization? So just very quickly to touch on where we're going, kind of a roadmap for a session, what I've selected is 5 areas for maturity today. And there are more, but this is what made sense in the context of our webinar. Is one, to talk a little bit about life cycle, because we're already doing that, and I know the other session that comes up in June is kind of finishing up the life cycle. It's talking about after action and post-shooting. But I want to start by, in this event, introducing a little more about the life cycle ideas. You know this. You know that the shooter has thought in most instances. In a true active shooting situation, right? So this is not a shooting incident. We're talking about a classic active shooter incident in which or situation in which the person is prepared, they have picked a target-rich environment, and they're going for numbers, right? So that's the kind of populated environment, target-rich environment we're discussing. Well, in that situation, we know that the shooter always has the tactical advantage because they've engaged in all this planning and all this preparation. And guess what? It was a big surprise for us when that first shot goes off, and then we're in our response mode. Well, just as the shooter has thought long before the event, if we look at something like a shooting in Oslo, Norway, and Utoya Island in July of 2011, Anders Breivik, who shot 69 kids out at the summer camp there, in court, he said he started this planning about 7 years prior. So we need to really look at the life cycle in terms of before, during, and after as being a pretty long cycle. We're going to talk about that a little bit today, but in part of that, we're going to expand our definition of where the workplace is and what that means to us in terms of active shooter response. We're going to talk a little bit more in number 2 here, bullet point 2, about the changing nature of the actual attacks. And many of us are keenly aware of attacks that are going around the world, going on at this very moment today, and what the nature of these attacks look like. They continue to morph, continue to change. So we're also going to change our ideas about threat assessment and bystander intervention. Now, 4 and 5 are going to be very, very close because historically what many of our organizations have done is when we use the term bystander intervention, you're thinking about run, hide, fight, and essentially you're probably thinking about fight, right? And that's accurate. I get that. But bystanders are your eyes and ears. They are actually your initial threat detection mechanism because it's not going to be a security guard. It's not going to be a police officer who picks up on some of these early behaviors. It's likely to be a coworker if it's a classic kind of coworker to coworker or several other variants we'll discuss in our class here today. So we're going to expand our models of threat assessment and expand what bystander intervention means. And there's one other direction we're going to extend bystander intervention, and that's post-incident, and I mean immediate post-incident. So the model I'm using today, folks, if you haven't been introduced to it, is a little bit beyond run, hide, and fight. And the way we refer to it is stop the killing, stop the dying, and stop the crying. And all of those will be more clear to you as we move our way through the program. So let's start by jumping in and talking life cycle. This will be an important way to discuss. And simply, this model, which I had in part helped develop for a special online 10-module project for the Justice Department and Office of Victims of Crime a couple years back, really was the application of the classic 4 phases of emergency management, right? So prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, applying them to the active shooter problem. And when you start to apply that model and drill down, it helps you with anticipating the life cycle and some of the challenges you're going to encounter. So having said that, what you see in my graphic here is I've boxed out the words preparedness, response, and recovery because that's where we're going to focus this session. We're not going to talk much about mitigation. And what I'd like to do during the program is discuss for you different ways to think about those 3 phases, different ways to up your game in preparedness, response, and recovery today. Now, obviously, even just on this one slide, the number of bullet points under any of those categories, preparedness, response, recovery, they're limited. There's obviously more challenges and more tasks to do, but I'm using this as a way kind of just to give you a sense of what I mean, at least in this life cycle model. Now, having done that, one of the first places I want to, kind of suggest or recommend we change our thinking. And this may be, for some of you already water under the bridge. You may have been there, done this already. But please do not create active shooter response plans or procedures or exercises that stand alone from your workplace violence policies, plans, procedures, and such. It is one manifestation. In fact, it's statistically the most rare, but obviously the most extreme manifestation of workplace violence. The most common weapon in workplace violence is hands and feet. It's pushes and shoves and kicks and punches. And obviously it even starts before that with psychological intimidation and verbal intimidation and all of that. And yeah, in a very, very rare number of these cases, they evolve to weapons involved and maybe evolve not just to a shooting incident involving a weapon, something very targeted where there was, one very identifiable or 2 very identifiable targets for the shooter, but evolving into the classic active shooter scenario where the person is going for numbers, where they're really looking for a mass casualty event. So I just want to use the next 2-3 slides very quickly. I'm not even going to linger on them, just to give you an idea of some of our life cycle thinking from a behavioral science standpoint, and then I'm going to move right past that because the concepts touched on in there, they're going to get swallowed up. They're going to get kind of embedded in everything else we do over the next few moments. And that's to kind of think to yourself from a behavioral standpoint, human factor standpoint. You know, what are the assumptions we should make about people's behavior in a shots fired scenario? You know, what are they likely to do? Are they likely to follow our plans? Are they likely to stampede towards the doors? If we think about, you know, someone calling out shots at LAX or JFK and we see this kind of stampede behavior, you know, what should we anticipate from people in a high-stress situation? So we refer to that very often as extreme stress responses. If you haven't had a chance, I think it's an excellent training tool. Go back and find the old documentary from HBO about the terror at the mall, the attack in Westgate Mall in Nairobi, Kenya, and just look at the closed-circuit television footage, hundreds of cameras of capturing how people behave. So the reason I bring this up, and again, you're starting to get the feeling already, I'm not going to be the speaker who reads each of the bullet points to you, is we know we're going to see some radical fight, flight, and fright behavior. And this goes back to the idea, of course, of accurate rehearsal, of training, and drilling and exercises because, as I mentioned before, during the crisis we fall to our training. Now, that's going to inform some of our discussion later around things like run, hide, fight. How do we train people? What do we tell them to do, and what do we really, truly want them to do in the moment? So I'm going to walk us quickly through some of the life cycle issues. Immediate phase, minutes to hours after the event, short term, hours to days, midterm, days to weeks, and into those early months, and then long term up to the first year anniversary. And obviously in the context of a 1-hour webinar, we're going to move through that content pretty quickly. So you're getting a feeling already about some of the, at least about the tempo that we'll be moving at and introducing this idea to you, as I said, which I think really helps you mature your existing plan, is to go beyond. That's an important word right there, beyond. This is not to say, hey, destroy, ditch, forget about the active shooter plans you have in place. They're no good. That's not my message. This is how do I add another layer on our existing active shooter plan that brings it to a new level of maturity. So we're going to start talking to you shortly about this idea of stopping the killing, stopping the dying, and stopping the crying. And it's going to start here again with our first set of recommendations. And that recommendation is expanding our definition of the active shooter event. Now, I'm going to do this very quickly, this slide, because I'm also making some assumptions that you are all familiar with OSHA's classic 4 types of workplace violence, right? So type 1 is criminal intent. That's the robbery at the convenience store, late at night, cash on hand, folks are all alone. And, certainly if a weapon's involved, the risk of violence, injury, death goes up dramatically. The second area, patient, customer, client-initiated violence you're familiar with, and you're probably very familiar how high those numbers are in healthcare and human services organizations. What most people think of course, when they think about workplace violence is the classic type 3 coworker to coworker, coworker to supervisor violence. We're all familiar with those cliches, about this disgruntled former employee, that kind of language. And increasingly, organizations have got their heads around the fact that domestic violence does follow people to work. We now look at that as type 4 workplace violence. Let's go beyond. Let's talk about the reality we see in our country and around the world today, and that is that despite OSHA's four-part model, there is a clearly 5th type of workplace violence. And the reason I bring this up, it goes back to what I said earlier. Please do not make your active shooter plans, policies, exercise stand alone or stand away from your workplace violence. Now, this is controversial. I get this, folks. There are people who say, oh, you know what? The shooting at Charlie Hebdo is terrorism. Shooting at Planned Parenthood in Colorado Springs is terrorism. But, folks, those are workplaces, aren't they? The vast majority of terrorism is directed at places where people are working. They're also workplaces. So type 5 violence, a little bit beyond OSHA's classic model, is ideological violence in which the motive of the shooter or shooters is much more like a terrorist sort of motive. In fact, you can think of this as the intersection of terrorism and workplace violence. It is driven by that extreme, that's the operative word, extreme views, politically, religiously, ideologically. So yes, this is the shooter who shoots up the Planned Parenthood clinic and his first day in court says, I'm a warrior for the babies. This is the person who walks in, or the two, who walk into an editorial meeting at Charlie Hebdo in Paris. And that's a photograph of these folks around the table having this meeting shortly before the attack begins. It is their workplace, but it is not one of those other 4 types of workplace violence. It is violence that comes to the workplace because of what the organization does or what the organization represents. If we do not teach our employees, if we do not create our plans to bring terrorism in as a potential source of violence to our workplace, you are cheating yourself. You're doing yourself a disservice, because the same eyes and ears that you are training in a workplace violence program to say, watch out for, these behaviors, you could piggyback on and say, and these are the signs of type 5 violence. This is what the pre-incident indicators of terrorism look like. This is what hostile surveillance looks like. This is what we should be looking for, in addition to the guy on the other side of the cubicle wall who now is increasingly angry and smoldering and seething with anger about some perceived injustice at work. So my invitation to you is, one of the key ways we start maturing our plan is look at our world today. There is a 5th type of workplace violence, and it comes from extreme ideology that finds you. It finds your company that maybe experiments with animals, if you're in life sciences or pharmaceuticals. It finds your company that works with genetically modified seeds or materials because they're an extremist from an environmental movement. It finds you at your workplace, not just because they're one of the classic 4 types, but because of what you do. Terror does come to the workplace, and it took us a while to realize that domestic violence came to the workplace. But there's a benefit by expanding that typology. As I said, it helps you educate your workforce. It creates the force multiplier effect that we have more people who understand that violence takes many different forms when it comes to work, and we need to be vigilant for all of those. Now, the other thing to think about, especially if you do buy into this idea that there's potentially a 5th type of workplace violence, type 5, is that these attacks may be conducted more like other sorts of terrorist attacks, not just the classic disgruntled employee. So if you're not already familiar, I want to take this term. You may be familiar by Tracy Frisano and Matt Snyder, which is the term hybrid targeted violence. This is multiple attackers, potentially in multiple locations, but they are geared up, right? So these are people who are true believers. This is San Bernardino, guys. If you're thinking about how does this apply to the workplace, where do we see this as an active shooter? This is San Bernardino, but it's Mumbai, and it's Westgate, and it's Paris, and it's San Bernardino, as I said, and elements of this even in the Boston Marathon bombing. So this is usually, as I said, it may be an individual, but maybe a group or just a small cell of people, but they are much more sophisticated. They are much more sophisticated. They are, again, much more willing to die. They have trained up. They have geared up, and they are they are much more in that terrorist mold to create the dynamic mass casualty event. So I want you to start by thinking about workplace violence. Is there that 5th type? Is there terrorism that comes to work? And I say yes, there is. When it comes to work, does it look different than other workplace violence? Yeah, sure it can. It can look like San Bernardino, where people are in tactical gear and they're kitted up and they're ready to roll. And if that's true, then how do I start to train my workforce around that? So we're going to jump ahead to our first poll question. And our first poll question today, actually I'm going to hand this back to Mike. Mike, if you could take us through that and get us started with our first poll question, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, Steve, thank you very much. Yeah, let's take advantage of the large crowd we have today and go out to you with a question. And I apologize in advance. I see a couple of typos in here, but let's just walk through that. In your opinion, can an employee working most or all of their time from a home-based office be subject to workplace violence in the setting? And that's a yes or a no question. And we will give us just a moment. Those in. Okay. While we're waiting, I just wanted to mention some of you have asked about a copy of the slide deck. It will be available in the resources panel when you get your link to the archived event tomorrow. Okay, so we have a great response right here. So let's go ahead and push the answer. 95% say yes. What do you think about that, Steve?
What I say is, in the way, hallelujah. Now, the question is, if we understand that, what are we doing about that? Because one of the things I see, and you may see in your organizations as well, is we may be thinking about, workplace violence and active shooter response as, the thing that happens when the bad guy comes to our office. What if that bad guy finds your employee at home? What if it's a manager who's terminated them 3 years ago and that manager now works all or part of the time at home? So as you mature your plans, that's our theme, right? So as we mature our plans, we need to also now start thinking beyond the walls. We need to think about our mobile workforce. And, with our partners at Everbridge, one of the topics we discussed a while ago is duty to care for mobile workers. Guys, what the numbers tell us is by 2020, nearly 75% of the U.S. workforce is going to be mobile. They're primarily going to be outside of the building for most of their job work. So we need to think about this because from OSHA's perspective, as you reflected in your opinion in the polls, the term workplace is synonymous with on the job and on duty. It's wherever you are. If you think about an employee who is traveling that day, walking through the airport in Fort Lauderdale when it all breaks loose with a shooter, are there responsibilities for us? Should we be thinking about how do we start educating our workers for violence that occurs beyond the walls? Because guess what, man? Within the walls, many of you probably have great security. You have, security infrastructure and apparatus and personnel and all kinds of stuff. And I tell you what, this photograph, it says it all to me. Here's our worker at home doing her thing, and there's that guy outside who's kind of been creeping on her, and who knows that motive. Is there a risk of violence when she's on the job at her home? So I want you to start thinking about the motives changing, maturing our idea about the type of violence that happens, to bring in this idea of type 5. And now I'd like you to think a little bit more about where workplace violence happens. And yes, whether it's a duty to care, it's OSHA, it's workers' comp, all the good reasons tell us we owe the same level of protections for our employees wherever they're working if they're on the clock for us. And I'm not touching base today on expats, but if you have employees working abroad, you may have some responsibility for their safety even in their downtime when they're not on the clock. And that may even extend to some of their families. So we need to continue to think, expand our thinking about who's at risk, what does that risk look like, and what are the appropriate countermeasures, and does our plan, do our policies, do they reflect the reality? If you agree with me that the nature of workplace violence has changed and terrorism is more, has come to work more often, if you agree with that idea and you agree with the idea that the workplace is changing and people are working outside of those walls, and we look at some of those statistics here, this kind of growing mobile workforce, it says that, when we started our active shooter plan, we started it right. We started with the moments of terror. We started with that brief window from shots fired to shooter down. And folks, this, that's like 5 minutes long, right? 5-6 minutes, the statistics tell us. But there's all that happens before, and there's all that happens after. And now we need to start building on that. And I understand why we started there, because it's the most frightening part, it's the most dramatic part, and it's the part we felt we had to start with, and it's correct. And now as the risk changes and our workplace changes, we've got to keep again, adapting our workplace violence and our active shooter posture because everything is changing. Mike, I'm going to throw it back to you because I know we're on to our second poll question.
Yes, we are, Steve. Our second poll question, does your organization have a trained threat assessment team? And let's give you a moment to respond here. While you're doing that, I just want to point out that our last poll question had over 1,300 responses. So it's really great to have this size audience and get, this is not just a web poll, this is 1,300 of your peers. Okay. All right, that's a good response, folks. Let's push this out to you. Does your organization have a trained threat assessment team? It's about 50-50, Steve. What do you think about that?
That sounds about right to me, and I think that in the in an ideal setting, everyone would say, either we've got it or, man, we know we need that and we would love to have it, but for whatever reasons, the nature of the organization, its budget, some other reasons, we can't do that. So I want to talk a little bit to those organizations that have existing threat assessment teams and those that don't, because there are still some key concepts from threat assessment that you can, I believe, educate yourself about. And I have to tell you, what we know about the behavior of the active shooter, it's different than the classic 4 types of just workplace violence. Now, I know some instances, and I had a slide that spoke to this early on, some classic aspects of workplace violence, they turn into active shooter events. Type 1, not so much, the robbery at the convenience store. Type 2, you know what? When we see violence in places like hospitals and healthcare, those instances of violence are almost always targeted violence. Someone's got it in for that doc or that nurse or the facility, and we've had some active shooters, but they're not someone looking for mass numbers. And in the workplace, we've had a few that are like that, but most workplace shootings tend to be more targeted as well. Type 4, the intimate partner, those get sloppy, and there's a lot of collateral damage when someone comes in with all that emotion, all that kind of romantic baggage, whatever that is, they tend to spill over and lots of other people get hurt. But type 5, if we think about that, that's that kind of ideological violence. The person is coming in looking for numbers. That's more likely to be that classic active shooter. Now, on the issue of threat assessment, the reason I bring that up is we know regardless of what type of workplace violence you are thinking about, you're holding in your mind right now, we know in most instances, classic workplace violence, especially the type 3, coworker to coworker, coworker to supervisor, those are almost always acts that arise out of a smoldering crisis. It's been going on a long time. Everyone knows this individual's got some kind of problem going on. They verbalized it. It's really kind of, very often not a huge surprise. You also know that nobody snaps. But here's the bottom line. Look at me for a moment with me at the bottom bullet. We are moving away in the behavioral sciences from purely warning signs to a much more sophisticated model that we talk about now as warning behaviors of someone who may be on a path to mass violence. That's what we're talking about here. So yes, it's important to educate your workers hey, look for changes in this person's behavior and look for changes in their work performance and look for them to be preoccupied with weapons or violence. Those are all accurate, but we're maturing this now. I want to bring this up a notch and want to start to talk about warning behaviors that correlate much more highly with the mass shooting or the active shooter situation and their difference. Let me give you an example just really, really quickly. Folks, just really kind of makes the point. How many times, think to yourself, have I heard in the wake of a shooting, especially a school shooting, that the person was a loner? And we've all learned that. Watch out for the person who's a loner. And this is an interesting thing. A couple of years ago, I was working at a pharmaceutical company doing a training, and they said to me, Steve, we have a problem. Every year we do our workplace violence training, and whoever we have, the instructor tells us we should watch out for the guy who's a loner. And every scientist who works here, they meet that profile. And they all can't be shooters, right? And I said, well, probably not all of them, but that is not helpful. We know there's no useful profile for someone on the pathway to be a mass shooter. What we learned in schools, for example, is we're not looking at kids who are loners. We're looking out for a kid who's an incompetent joiner. Think about that phrase. The incompetent joiner is that kid who wants to be sitting at the cool kid lunch table, wants to go to the date, wants to go to the dance, wants to be on the team, but he's a little bit socially awkward. He gets pushed away. He leaves feeling hurt, angry, and some subset of those people feel they need to strike back. Well, here I'm going to give you some literature, right? And I'm going to suggest that you, regardless if you have a threat assessment team or not, drill down a little bit into these free resources and learn a little bit more about the warning behaviors. There's 8 identified warning behaviors that tell us 3 things. 1, they tell us that the person may be on a pathway to violence, and many of you are familiar with that concept. Second, more important, where on the pathway are they? Beginning, middle, or imminent risk, right towards the end of the pathway. And lastly, are they accelerating on that pathway? Because you got to remember, right, the big question in threat assessment, folks, is not just did this person make a threat. Because you know there's some people who make threats are never going to do anything. There are people who do dangerous and deadly things who have never made a threat at all, and there are people who make a threat and they act on the threat. We can't necessarily tell the difference, even in good threat assessment. So the big question at the end of the day is not who makes a threat, it's who poses a threat. And how do we know that? It's through very specific behavior and communication. Not profiling, behavior and communication. That's what the warning behaviors are about. Now, I'm only going to have a chance to dig into 2, and dig in is probably an injustice. I'm going to have time to touch on 2. The first of these is identification. And here you have the citation, so please go back to the archive later, download these slides, dig in and get these resources. They're online for free, and you can do some self-study for you and your threat assessment team. Identification is the person who sees themselves as a warrior for the cause. This is our shooter who walks into Planned Parenthood. His first day in court, his arraignment, he stands up and he says, verbatim, I am a warrior for the babies. That's his motive for shooting up Planned Parenthood. Anders Breivik is July 22nd. There's a typo there, I see. I'm sorry. 2011, not 2001. He starts the morning by detonating a car bomb in the government district of Oslo. It kills 8 people, and he takes the ferry out to Utoya Island, targeting a rival political wing's youth camp, a pro-immigrant youth camp, because Breivik, he thinks he's on a mission to protect the ethnic purity of Norway. 69 kids dead, 8 dead in the city from the bomb, and he sees himself as this warrior. He's had his mom sewing him police uniforms and military uniforms. She thought he was into role-playing or costume playing. He shows up for the attack in a police uniform, and the kids ran to him. So this is someone who is preoccupied with military paraphernalia, but also sees themselves as this kind of, on this mission, you know, as a warrior. You want to think about a good example of this. Many of you I know have seen the video Run, Hide, Fight. If you look at the guy in the video, our shooter, the close crop hair, he's in black BDUs, he's got his black Oakleys on, he's got that whole kind of military sniper SWAT vibe going on. So this is that identification that's referred to as a pseudo-commando. And in this way, that is, you know, one of our pathway indicators of someone not looking for workplace violence in the classic sense, someone who's on the pathway to that mass shooting. The second of these, and as I said, I'm just touching on these. I really encourage you to drill down in the research, and you see the citation again on the slide. The concept of leakage. That is the idea that people have this tendency to tell third parties where they're headed, what they're moving, what they're doing. Folks, I think it was yesterday we saw the sentencing of a associate of Dylan Roof, the shooter in the church Bible study session, because he knew of this event and failed to tell people. We understand that this very, very commonly, people have a tendency to let other people know. And you see some of our statistics, 67% of adults, 58% of adolescents. In a smaller study by Dr. Marianne O'Toole at the FBI, at that time, 100% in her small study had told people about the attack. Now, what's changed in leakage for us is not the leakage itself. It's not that people It's not that people have changed their motives or their ideas. Very often it's hopelessness, it's despair, it's the end of the world. But how they tell us is now much more likely to be in electronics. It's likely to be in their Snapchats and Instagrams and Facebook's posts in all of those places. So that's kind of where I want to leave that. Mike, I know we want to jump ahead to the next poll question, the last one for the session, and then keep moving.
That's good. Yes, so the question is, if you have identified and prepared safe rooms or shelter rooms for an active shooter incident, do employees know how to care for others medically or psychologically in an extended period of being locked down or locked in?
We'll let that kind of simmer with the group just for a moment or two.
Okay, we have, right now we have about 800 respondents, and I'm gonna push this now because I think the first part of that question was if you do have that safe room or shelter room. So I think the respondent number is telling us something, but then the response here is 82% responded no, Steve. What do you think about that?
That, and unfortunately, that's kind of, that's about the proportion I expected. And I'll tell you why, and I want to help you change that number. Now, believe it or not, I know I've been going at a pretty good tempo throughout the whole program. I'm actually going to pick it up because I want to make sure we get through some critical ideas about bystander interventionist response gap and actually start to bring in those concepts I mentioned about the transition from just run, hide, fight to stop the killing, stop the dying, stop the crying. Now, I'm actually going to blow through the next few slides very quickly because I'm also making the assumption that many people are familiar that police and EMS now, have radically changed their tactics about how they enter an active shooter event. A lot of this changed post-Columbine, as you know, where they held their position, held the perimeter, waited for special teams to arrive. It was 47 minutes before the first officer went in. Obviously, we re-examined everything in tactical response after that. You got to second generation thinking, and you got to waiting for, our team to show up, formed up into a T, formed up into a diamond, moved in as a formation, going on the hunt for the shooter. Everyone's familiar, as I said. Most people, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. You know kind of where we're at now. The two variants are, one, the possibility of solo officer entry. First responding officer may go in or wait for one other officer to go in as two people. FBI statistics a year or two ago told us 1 out of every 3 officers who goes in alone, they're going to get shot themselves. So very, very high-risk endeavor. But you also should be familiar with MACTAC. MACTAC is that, just as the acronym applies, multiple assault, counter-terrorist action capabilities. What is that? That's Paris, when we had attacks simultaneously, bombs outside the stadium, shooting the Bataclan concert hall, shootings outside the restaurant district, and we had multiple attackers, multiple locations. That's also the siege in Mumbai years ago. How would we respond to that? So my point is for you that obviously police response has continued to evolve based on how the threat has evolved. EMS has begun to evolve too. And if you're not familiar, the key word here, or the key phrase would be rescue task force. And these are lessons taken from combat casualty care out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan, to tell us now that most people who die in shooting events, they die by bleeding out, and they die in the first few minutes. So we have to get involved in bleeding control. We have to stop that as quickly as possible. So now we envision that many of your jurisdictions are training up EMS to work in the warm zone under the cover of officers, and those EMS people, they may be geared up in tactical vests, tactical helmets, not weapons in most instances, just to go hands-on with those people as quickly as possible because that's going to save lives. Stop the killing. That's run, hide, fight. That's Alice. That's alert. That's whatever model you've trained in. Yes, you have to train and you have to prepare your people to survive the shooting. But let's examine that for a moment. Because the original model was fight as a last resort. If you were in Orlando in the Pulse nightclub on the night of the shooting last June, what did people do? They ran. Where they run? Into the restrooms where they hid. And the shooter follows them in, and we have a massacre. If we teach people in sequence, run first, run if you can, hide if you can, fight if you must, but fight only as a last resort. That was the original message from Homeland Security to trickle down. We may be depriving people of situations in which fight may be the first option or the second option. So I want you to think about breaking away from a linear and sequential model of these three options. They're still, I believe, the correct options. But if we train people, oh, you have to try to run first, or you have to try to hide first, and fight is only the last resort, we are probably cheating people out of the opportunity for survival in some instances. If you're not familiar with the research from Blair, again, the citation we can make available to you. Really interesting study. I know that graphic is small on your screen. Let me explain it very quickly. To the right of the center line is after the police arrive. To the left of the center line, before police arrive. This is 83 cases. In 40, that's to the left, the event ended before the police arrived. In about 40% of those cases, it was ended by bystander intervention. You are all familiar with the idea of the response gap. That's the time between those first shots are fired and the police arrive. The police arrive, it changes everything. The shooter goes from being the hunter to being the hunted. Very often they end their own life. Everything changes in an active shooter event as soon as the first police are boots on the ground. But what do we do in the meantime? Well, if we know bystander intervention is so critical, you have to go into some depth and educate people about what it means. It means distract, disrupt, disarm, and what resources are available to me, improvised weapons or other weapons that may be suitable. The bystander intervention today also means getting hands on the victim. It means BCON or bleeding control because most people are going to die of shots. And this is why I asked the poll question. Guys, you cannot imagine anything more traumatic than your employees have made it to a safe room, but one or two of them have been shot, and we locked ourselves in the safe room with an injured person, and it's going to be a long time before the police get to us, clear that building, and go hands-on with that victim. How are your employees going to tolerate standing back and watching someone else who's wounded and not being able to appropriately care? So old school was wait for EMS, was wait for police. New school, DHS, if you're not familiar, the national campaign, folks, go online and just search Stop the Bleed. Great resources, videos, handout materials that start to teach people about bleeding control, the basics of hemorrhage control, the basics of gauze, the basics of tourniquet, just things that, again, everyone can use to stop the dying. We survived the event. That stopped the killing. Now we need to be concerned about stopping the dying. That's bleeding control. And if you're not familiar, I know there's a lot of good resources. We see people now in organizations who've started to put small trauma kits into their AED boxes on the wall. Some have put trauma kits on the wall in those areas that contain treated gauze, tourniquets, chest seals, things like that. Some of them, the ones I mentioned here with audio prompts, really, really innovative vendors in the marketplace where you open that trauma kit and it talks to you like an AED machine talks to you, tells you how to get that gauze on, tells you how to use that tourniquet. And you see some of those really, really creative folks have thought about, how do I bundle this? And here I've got a wall-mounted unit that actually has pepper spray or pepper gel as well as a trauma kit in it. So I'm putting some sort of, defensive weapon in the tool of our folks during the attack. I'm not selling products here, guys. I'm telling you, as the threat has evolved, the obvious need to leverage your bystanders, pre-event as early detection, event and potentially taking down the shooter, right, fight, post-event, immediate post-event in stopping the dying through the use of these good tools. And the market continues to evolve around that reality. I want to talk in our closing minutes about stopping the crying. And I'm not talking about after the fact. I'm not talking about the grief and the shock and the horror caused by these events, but during the event. Every time I show Run, Hide, Fight, which has been a great training video, and a lot of us have got a lot of mileage out of it over the years, you may remember Susie Red Sweater. She's the woman in the break room when her coworkers are getting ready to fight the shooter who's freaking out. And whenever I show that video, we get some snickers in the room, and people say, well, what would we do with her? And my answer is, this is where Stop the Crying comes in, psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is intended for the 0 to 48 hours of the traumatic event. It is now. It is not post-crisis. It's not call your EAP for trauma counseling. It's how do I help? And this is what psychological first aid is about. Reducing fear and arousal. How do I help calm that person down? Because, man, if she keeps freaking out, she's going to be what gets us killed. We have to manage that behavior. Now, I just want to make a very quick distinction. Very good stuff out in the market. There's a big national push for mental health first aid, and that is good, but that is not what I'm talking about. In mental health first aid class, people learn about the major mental illnesses, mood disorders, thought disorders, anxiety disorders, and such. They learn the signs and symptoms. They learn how to help someone in a mental health crisis, but the assumption is the person has or is developing a diagnosable mental health condition. That's not what psychological first aid is. Psychological first aid is, in the immediate wake of a crisis, traumatic event. How do I help reduce fear and arousal and get that people functional? That is a huge benefit to us during the crisis in getting our workforce in the right mindset and having them be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Lastly, of course, you need to think about how we pull this all together during the crisis. You know, where are we going? Where is the shooter? And I just always go back to this first bullet point that I've highlighted and I bolded. There is no better way to foil the shooter than to deprive them of their targets. And that's through rapid, deployable communications, to let people know where the crisis is, to let them know in plain language, no codes, plain language, what they need to be doing, when they'll get more information. People need information. And what the science is, and I'd love to do this, folks, it's a whole other discussion about how people interpret and process that kind of threat information. But we know we need to get the message to them quickly, and that means having technologies and templates and your people on top of messaging. What's happening, where it's happening, what to do, and what's going to happen next. So when we do that, and we know that we need to continue those communications, because even when we give people the all clear, there's going to be the need for ongoing communication for hours and days. That's part of our life cycle idea, to leverage those communication technologies but build them today. I have, unfortunately, with my work both with local and federal law enforcement and my work in the private sector, been a responder to many different shooting events around the country. And the thing I've learned is that the learning curve on these events is incredibly steep. And once that shot's fired, that first shot, there's going to be very little time for clear thought. Get those ducks in a row. Think about how you take this information and take your active shooter plans to the next level. That's the concept of maturity. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank you all for your participation. I know Mike's going to take us through some Q&A, and I'm willing to happy to stay online a little bit after the top of the hour if we've got some good questions, folks. Mike, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Great stuff. And yes, this is the time to get in your questions. We do already have a lot of questions, but every question we ask helps us weight what you're interested in, as well as it helps with future presentations. So let's get right into it. Steve, our first question. How are you addressing liability concerns around telling or expecting an employee to respond to an active shooter, either through fight response or by bleeding control? The concerned employer can be held liable if the employee attempts to stop the killing and either gets killed or injured, or the post-trauma experienced by the employee who attempts to stop the bleeding, but their fellow employee died.
There's a couple different ways around that, and you do have to weigh this both sides. One is in your jurisdiction, and it varies in states. Things like Volunteer Protection Acts, things like, we refer to as Good Samaritan, sorts of doctrines or positions, but also the temperament of your individuals. You can encourage people. You could say, we're providing training. And I would say, if you think about bleeding control, a lot of organizations, what they'll do, around your question, and I am going to this question, is say, I know that not everyone's going to be able to do that. They either don't have the temperament or they're not going to tolerate the consequences well. or they're fearful for whatever reason. Think about how many people you've trained in your organization for CPR. It's not everyone, but you've got a number of CPR responders in the organization, people who know how to use the AED, people who know how to do CPR. They volunteered, they got the training, they're willing to step forward. So the model of how you would use CPR in a crisis in your workplace is fairly comparable in most places when you start to talk to lawyers in different areas about the liability issues, is comparable. We could provide the tools just like you would provide an AED. So my comparable point, and I know it's hairy in the active shooter case. But if I have an employee who goes down in a cardiac arrest, and I'm the guy who took the CPR and the AED course, and I pull that unit off the wall, and I stick those patches on that guy's chest, I wait for the prompt, it says go ahead and shock him, and I lose this guy. EMS shows up, they do their thing, and we can't revive this guy. He's a goner. What is the impact on my employee who did CPR or AED and lost that person? Would they have felt worse if there was nothing they could have done and they stood by and watched that guy die? So I hate to say this. It's an incredibly wishy-washy answer, but it all depends on the totality of the circumstances. That's kind of a lawyerly response, right? And how you look at it with your internal legal department, how you consult with your local offices of emergency management around volunteer protections, and how you expand employee-to-employee care, the way you think about AED and CPR use. Can you expand that logically, or is that a bridge too far? So I'd ask you to think about it in terms comparable to your CPR and your AED training.
Very good. Yes, the question was somewhat lawyerly, so the response has to be somewhat lawyerly as well, I would think. Next question. Any tips for security measures for our remote employees? Is it just training that you're talking about?
No, it's not. Some of it's physical security as well. I mean, it is training about situational awareness. It's about training about how to de-escalate a situation if they're confronted. It's training about, kind of early detection. If there are good products, if you're using an advanced notification tool, some of those have emergency features to let your employer know you're in a jam, you need help. So it tends to be a blend, believe it or not, even if they're off-site and they're in the field, it tends to be a blend of different physical security and practices, security practices that the employee can do. And like that, just to add one, if you think about my question earlier about working from home, there's this concept of, security through physical design. And very often, in your municipal police department, there's an officer who is committed to be the crime prevention officer who might be able to work with your organization or your other external vendors and say, what information, what checklist do I give to my employee about how to prepare their in an office at home to make it safe? How do they recognize mail security if they're receiving something directly from home? How would they recognize a suspicious package? Do they trim the shrubbery around their house? Do they have different lighting around their house if they're working from home? How do they combine both physical security and security practices both in the office when they're moving in a mobile capacity, when they're in a fixed position like their home office? So the simple answer is it is not just training. It tends to be, just as you do in the bricks and mortar workplace, it tends to be a blend of physical security apparatus and technologies, and then also security practices.
Very good. Our next question. In many cases, the workplace also includes clients or visitors present. Your staff might be trained, but how do you make your clients and visitors aware? Example, a shopping mall or a large warehouse.
Different organizations do this differently, and you're going to have to modify any suggestions I give. Everyone at this point understands active shooters are risk. Little kids in school are practicing this today, right? They're doing their active shooter drills. There are many organizations I visit that when you walk in the door and you get your visitor's pass, maybe you're given a little card or brochure. Maybe it's on the back of your visitor's pass, but there's some basic emergency actions. And the three basic actions are essentially, evacuate. If you hear a PA announcement or something of that order, this is how we evacuate and this is what we do. And lock down or lock in, and this is what we do. And so we give everybody that, and then maybe even by practice when we hand someone a security badge, we tell them that information's there or we give them that. In a place like a mall, it may be through public service announcements and posters and other ways that we continue to provide people with information. I know that most of us, in the mall are in a state of being somewhat oblivious. It's not. Well, I'm probably talking to the wrong group today. We're probably all operating at code orange and yellow when we're at the mall. But most civilians, when they're in the mall, are just they're looking at all the shiny things. So it would have to be a layered approach to communication, including maybe even announcements, at a time that says, please be aware of mall security practices. Think about when you get on an airplane, right? I mean, you get the briefing. I'm not suggesting we each need a briefing every time you walk in the mall, but you combine this, you layer this. There's a pocket card in the back seat of your the airplane pocket that gives you some basics. The flight attendant gets up, he or she gives you some basics. So in a multi-layered way, regardless of your setting, are there different communications, whether printed or audio or other technologies in which you are sharing with people that, you do have these emergency plans, and as a guest here, please be aware. Hey, folks, go catch a movie this weekend. First thing you're going to see on the screen after the ad for soda and popcorn is, be vigilant about your emergency exits. So I hate to say this, guys, tragedy drives innovation. And every time we have another one of these active shooter events, it pushes us a little further down the field to think about what do we do next. Well, we can cross-pollinate. You can think about the way these risks are managed in other environments. As I said, on an airplane, as you get briefed by the flight attendant, things like that nature. And think to yourself, would this work in my warehouse? Would this work in my office or in my shopping mall? So it tends to be multi-layered, and you need to look at the public as a partner, not necessarily as a victim, because people are going to be very invested in their own survival when that shot's fired, and they're not going to be amenable to taking direction during the crisis. If you can provide a pre-event, or as they're just casually doing their thing, hopefully some of that is absorbed and pays dividends during an actual crisis.
Very good. Folks, we are a little past the top of the hour, but we got a lot of great questions left. I would just say to all those who are attending for continuing education units, you have met that obligation. If you have other places you need to be, please go ahead and go. We're going to, Steve, if you don't mind staying around for just a couple minutes, we'll take a couple more questions.
No, I'm happy to. Please do.
Okay, outstanding. Any tips on developing realistic active shooter scenarios for drills?
Well, the first thing I'll tell you, and I get questions like this often, and sometimes our clients as well will ask, the first thing to remember when you start your scenario work is you write your objectives first. Before you write your story and say, what do we want to test in the drill? Is it notification? Is it employees moving effectively out of the building or into safe rooms? Is it liaison with incoming first responders and things of that nature? What do we want to test? And a reasonable amount of objectives is something like 2-3 objectives for an exercise. Then write your scenario so it links up with your objectives. But and a mistake commonly made in exercising is that people say, why don't we do a case kind of like the one we just saw on the news, see how people would respond here, let's write a story from scratch or whatever. But they create the story and see how people react to it, essentially, if they're doing the right things. Folks, remember this. The entire purpose of running an exercise is to test your plan. It's not to test people. If you write a scenario first, even if it's the coolest story, it ought to be on the next episode of 24. Even if you write the coolest story, if you don't line it up with your objectives first, you're not going to get a benefit out of the exercise, and that's where you actually risk maybe even traumatizing or frightening some people. And you don't want to do that because, guys, if your workforce sees that you do not respond well or the plan didn't hold water, you decrease confidence in your workforce that you're going to do this well, and it is very, very hard to unscare people after the fact. So you want to do this in a very planful way. You want to do it in a transparent way, but you want to do your scenarios driven by objectives. And that's the best way I could say. Rather than thinking about the story, Mike, and include this aspect and include that aspect, whatever your objectives are, make them smart, make them manageable, and again then, make your storyline line up to test your actual objectives. Remember that idea. The whole point of the exercise is to test the plan. It's not to test people.
Very good. Steve, how frequently would you do drills? Does that depend on the situation, like saying it's in a school facility versus a warehouse?
Yeah, it does. I mean, you have to balance it with the reality of kind of your environment and your workflow and what your perceived risks are. There's a lot of things that go into that. So there's no standard. I mean, if I had to say a standard, it should be no less than once a year and probably more realistically twice a year. I mean, I know I live here in northern New Jersey. In the school settings, there's a requirement for them to be doing these, I believe, monthly from the Department of Education. But realistically, knowing how that they can be a really heavy lift and they can be very disruptive, you need to think that through. But the other thing you can do is segment them, which means if you have different buildings or different parts of buildings or different ways that your organization is kind of geographically structured or segmented, you don't have to test the whole organization at the same time. You can think to yourself, we're going to just do, let's use a hospital for scenario right now. We're going to do the emergency department, or we're going to just do this wing of the hospital. So in that way, you may actually be running several exercises throughout the year, but you're segmenting them in a way that make them more manageable because the needs of people in different departments or buildings or parts of the organization, what their risks and what their resources are like for an active shooter, can be very, very different. So as a minimum, you ought to be doing 1 to 2 a year, I think just as good sense as a posture of defensibility. But you have to exercise it because I have to, share with you, a question in the courtroom is, did you have a plan? Did you train people on your plan? Did you exercise and test the plan? How did you know it really worked? And then a subset of that later is, how do you maintain your plan? Because if you haven't had an active shooter event, knock on wood, how do you keep the plan, the training, and everything fresh? So you should be exercising it in a way that's realistic, and that may mean segmenting it. And for all you know, depending on how you're segmenting it, you may be doing 1 a month to cover your whole organization. But I would not be doing the whole organization necessarily all at the same time, unless it's a moderate or a modestly sized organization.
Very good. We are creeping up on our hard stop. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all the time we have for today's presentation. I'd like to thank you for attending today's security management webinar. Don't forget to take advantage of the resources in the panel, and please, when you get that email tomorrow with the archive link, do take a moment to give us your feedback. You will as well be able to get a copy of the presentation on there as well. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Everbridge, for making this series of events possible. We're really proud to partner with them and bring this caliber of content to ASS members at no cost. And finally, to Steve Crimando for generously sharing his expertise. Steve, we look forward to your presentation in June.
I'm looking forward to it as well, Mike. Thanks so much, everybody, for spending the time with us today. Thanks again.
For ASIS and Security Management Magazine, I'm Mike Moran. Have a great day.